But legacy mainstream media, specifically those rooted in the West, in my opinion, have been some of the most culpable of not only suppressing the suffering of Palestinian people and now Lebanese people, but entirely erasing it from existence. We don't see in real time what's happening to Palestinians in Gaza and Rafah and Deir al-Balah. We're not seeing what's happening to Lebanese right now in real time across the south of Lebanon and Beirut. If it wasn't for social media, especially for those individuals on the ground across Gaza, the Mu'tazes, the Bissans, the Wal Dahdouhs, to really use their phones as new media tools to convey what's happening in real time on the ground, we wouldn't know what's happening in these places. And I think there's a clear double standard that the lives of Muslims don't mean as much, aren't valued at the same level, which I think is clear-cut evidence of governmental leaders devaluing Muslim lives in ways that we've seen not only now, a year into this genocide, but during every day and stage of this genocide.
1 year of genocide in Gaza. What has the world learned? What have we witnessed? And what is the road forward for Palestinians and those that are concerned about their plight? Joining us today is Professor Khaled Beydoun, a professor of law, an author of several books on Islamophobia, and one of the foremost social media activists coming out of America with over 2 million followers. Khaled Beydoun, it's an honor to have you here on our podcast today. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam. It's great to be here with you today.
Alhamdulillah.
Before we begin the podcast, a quick message from our sponsor. If you're Muslim and you care about your money, download this right now. The Halal Money app. An incredibly well-designed and easy-to-use financial app that allows you to open an account, deposit money, and spend through a Visa debit card they give you to use in your everyday transactions, away from the hands of a bank that's reveling in interest and even using your money in haram places. Download it now. Let's get back to the podcast.
Straight out of Detroit, Michigan. Now, we just had news come out today that one of your friends from Michigan, the head coach of the New York Jets, Robert Saleh, who was the first ever Muslim NFL head coach, he just lost his job today.
Yep.
After literally wearing the Lebanese flag only a couple days ago. Yep. Many are saying like this is a clear act of racism, perhaps Islamophobia. What is your take on the matter, given that you know Robert?
Yeah, Robert's a childhood friend of mine. We grew up in the same community. His older brother, David's also a good friend. Look, I think I think him wearing the Lebanese flag this past Sunday was the reason. It was the justification that ownership finally had to let him go. He wasn't, he was sort of a mixed bag for him in terms of performance. But the fact that he took that visible stance and everybody was talking about the fact that he was wearing that Lebanese patch on his jacket, I think was the conduit. It was the catalyst that gave ownership, reason to fire him. Even ESPN, I was watching ESPN, which is a major sports outlet in the United States, called it bizarre timing to fire him.
Yeah, I think it's very, very difficult to ignore the timing of the effect of what took place. No doubt about that. We've just passed the anniversary of October 7th, where days after a year after the October 7 attacks, and many world leaders, politicians have published press releases giving their condolences to the Israeli community about their sympathy that they are feeling towards the Israeli people on this day. And whether that's Barack Obama, Kamala Harris, or even our own Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, within all their press releases, they've all failed to mention the suffering that the Palestinians have endured in the past year. Why do you think this is the case? And why are they so afraid to acknowledge our suffering?
For a range of reasons. I think above all, I write in the area of Islamophobia, and the very sort of baseline or essence of Islamophobia is the dehumanization of a people based on race, but also their religion. And I think there's a clear double standard that the lives of Muslims don't mean as much, aren't valued at the same level. And are not acknowledged at the same level, especially at a political, at the political, governmental level, which I think is clear-cut evidence of governmental leaders devaluing Muslim lives in ways that we've seen not only now, a year into this genocide, but during every day and stage of this genocide.
Definitely. And we've also seen media institutions play a tremendous role in this genocide that's taking place right now. Al Jazeera has just published an exclusive documentary whereby they had whistleblowers from both CNN and the BBC who all came out and said words like genocide were being suppressed. Whenever they had a guest on a show mention the word genocide, they were prompted to shut the word down, telling them that the word is offensive, you can't use that terminology, it's going to offend our Israeli viewers. And censorship like this within media platforms is taking place according to this exclusive interview. What's your take on the matter in terms of the media's role in the continuation of this genocide?
Yeah, I think that, look, in many respects, the legacy media, right? Media is not monolithic, and I can talk about that in a bit. But legacy mainstream media, specifically those rooted in the West, in my opinion, have been some of the most culpable in conveying this very distorted, uneven narrative of not only suppressing the suffering of Palestinian people and now Lebanese people, but entirely erasing it from existence, right? So we don't see in real time what's happening to Palestinians in Gaza and Rafah and Deir al-Balah. We're not seeing what's happening to Lebanese right now in real time across the south of Lebanon and Beirut. There's been only sort of vague and ambiguous generalized coverage of the suffering that's been inflicted on Palestinians and Lebanese, Arab lives in general, Muslim lives in general, which in some respects, I think has exposed the hypocrisy that we've always known, especially older generations. Younger generations have been, very sort of innovative in filling those voids by using the emergence of social media. So if it wasn't for social media, especially for those individuals on the ground across Gaza, the big names that we all know, the Mu'tazes, the Bissans, the Wael Dahdouhs, to really use their phones as new modern, media tools to convey what's happening in real time on the ground, we wouldn't know what's happening in these places. I mean, I was young when the war in Iraq was taking place, where roughly 1.5 million Iraqi civilians were slain in real time. We didn't see that because legacy media had a monopoly. And tied to your first question, don't see it as newsworthy to report on the mass slaughter and the mass killing of Arab and Muslims, whether it's Iraq then or whether it's Palestine and Lebanon today.
So there's definitely a dehumanization of the Palestinians that we're seeing, whether that's failing to report on the murder of the Palestinian people. I remember, for instance, watching a Channel 9 report. So basically, Channel 9 is one of the Australian public broadcasters on television, when they reported about the hostages that were rescued by the Israeli forces, which was also suspected of having US involvement in terms of US soldiers in that mission to so-called rescue those 4 hostages. There were over 200 civilians that were killed, and Australian media failed to make mention of the fact that there were over 200 Palestinian civilians that were killed in that rescue operation. So while they were celebrating that rescue operation, they completely dismissed the fact that 200 people had to die for this to take place. We're also seeing several media platforms fail to mention who murdered the victims in Gaza. I literally just saw a BBC or a Sky News article, actually. It was a Sky News article sympathizing with the killing of Hind. 6-year-old girl dies in Gaza, and it gets 13,000 retweets or whatnot. But why don't we mention who killed this 6-year-old girl? So on the back of that question, can we say that the media is complicit in genocide?
Yeah, so, complicity, as you know, having a legal background, there's a legal definition of the word complicity, and then there's a sort of like broader popular definition for what complicity means. I think that they are complicit in sort of curating this broader narrative that Palestinian and Lebanese lives don't matter, right? So the vignette you raise about Hind is very telling. I mean, if you read any article about Hind, for instance, language also matters, right? So in addition to them not talking about who the killers were and the fact that she was shot over 350 times, there's no sort of context, no sort of broader meticulous articulation of the actual story in ways that is generally the case when the victims are Israeli or the victims are even Ukrainian, right? But even beyond that, the complicity comes with regard to making sure that they craft a grand narrative where Muslim lives are at best footnotes to a broader sort of crisis or catastrophe. And you see that even with the political language of a character like a Kamala Harris. So I would definitely say complicit with regard to the optics of the way in which the story is conveyed. Legally complicit, you know, perhaps it's arguable, right? But it's something I think to further interrogate.
Definitely. I recall an article early on in October 2023 by BBC actually investigating the Israeli claim. Are there Hamas tunnels under these schools? And literally days after that article was published, you had a series of strikes taking place on schools in Gaza. So like to tie the two and two together, it's not that much of a stretch. One Path Network also conducted a research, I think it was in 2016, and you're a professor in law, but also you're someone who has, you know, a strong suit in Islamophobia. We conducted an investigation into the role of the Australian media in promoting Islamophobia. And we found out that there were over 3,000 articles in a single year that portrayed Muslims and Islam in a negative light. And what's interesting about this is that this investigation took place in 2016. What happened 3 years later? The Christchurch massacre. 50 Muslims killed inside a mosque. And our study actually went viral after the Christchurch massacre because people began to realize that, hey, there are real world implications for language from the media. So what would be your take on that?
Yeah, and that's in my work, you know, and sort of like, you know, my legal framing of Islamophobia. And the two aren't distinct, right? So I'm a professor of law, but Islamophobia is convergent with the law, right? When you talk about many of the policies that are in place in countries like the United States, across Europe, here in Australia, that are based on this idea that Muslims are, you know, prone or have some sort of like, you know, propensity for terrorism. Much of the law is Islamophobic in nature, especially during this war on terror. What you're talking about is very important. It's what I call dialectical Islamophobia. So when you have politicians, news pundits, newspapers engage in these histrionics about who Muslims are, primarily in your research found this out, only framed and only talked about within the frame of terrorism, it basically gives license, right? It gives sort of authorization to citizens on the ground that we need you to keep a watchful eye on these Muslims. We need you during times of crisis to kind of, serve as vigilantes, if you will, like enlisted individuals acting on behalf of the state to protect our national security. So the media becomes complicit, using your language, arguably in a legal way, when there's a direct correlation between what it is that they're covering and reporting and the kind of causal effect it has on giving rise to hate crimes and hate incidents. And we can map that, you've raised the Christchurch incident. During times of Trump, there were many studies in the United States when he was talking about, initially introducing the Muslim ban, or then later talked about Islam hates us. When he was saying these explicitly Islamophobic things, hate crimes and hate incidents skyrocketed in the United States. So that's when media becomes a catalyst or a conduit in encouraging and emboldening hate crimes against Muslims.
Okay. No, that's something very important to take into consideration. On that point, we're seeing, legacy media slowly being phased out, and that's also being replaced by social media. You're highly active on social media. We have One Path Network, also highly active on social media. But even social media in and of itself is not safe from censorship, content suppression. I'm sure you've experienced your fair share of content suppression. What is the response to the censorship, whether that's from Mark Zuckerberg and Meta, or even, I would argue, Elon Musk, who champions himself as an advocate for freedom of speech, yet we know he's tied to the Israeli lobby?
Well, look, that question is really germane to the previous question in the sense that one thing we have to acknowledge is that both legacy media and digital media are both privately owned, generally speaking, with some exception, right? There's the ABC, the BBC, the CBC, which are government-owned news networks. But then the vast majority of them, which are really influential, are privately owned. And privately owned outfits, whether it's big tech, social media platform, or a newspaper like a Sky News, have a clear-cut political bias that's tied to economic interests, right? So that's one thing we have to acknowledge whenever we sort of engage with or speak on these platforms. Meta, for one, has deep, apart from them being a business which has the primary objective of maximizing their profit, they also have intimate ties with the state of Israel, right? You might have heard of Unit 8200 of the IDF, which is their surveillance arm. There's a really, really proximate symbiosis between that agency and Meta. So the suppression is not surprising. So when you have, for instance, accounts like mine that are shadow banned, flagged, during many stages of this past year, my Instagram Live was disabled, and that's one way in which I was able to engage in, real-time rolling conversation on important issues. It's not a coincidence, right? So their objective is to suppress voices that are not even critical, but oftentimes even fair-handed on this issue. So I know that, and I think that for young people, it's critical to know that oftentimes we look at things from a perspective of fairness, symmetry, equality. That is not the proper sort of prism when assessing these questions within, Western context like the United States or Australia. These platforms are driven by power, right? And those who wield and hold power behind the scenes dictate which stories make it to the top and which stories are suppressed.
Yes. No, we've definitely seen that. I also feel that sometimes, I could be wrong when saying this, but sometimes I feel like people like Mark Zuckerberg, who are driven, as you mentioned, financially, by financial decisions, could they be in somewhat of a compromised position whereby they're saying, we want, these 2 billion Muslims on our platform, but we don't want this Palestinian content. And they're kind of like in two minds about, whether we allow the content, and it's flooding social media. Even with the censorship in place, pro-Palestinian content is still flooding social media. I would argue perhaps like, and the content platform owners are unable to suppress the content just because of the sheer volume of the content that is pro-Palestinian.
Well, look, I mean, from my study of this stuff, and I've studied like the intersection of like tech and law and speech on these platforms as just like a research interest of mine. Pro-Palestinian content is good for the business of Meta because it brings it brings eyes, it brings attention. I've lived on Instagram for a year. That's good for the company, right? They call it stickiness. Like how much can you make your social media platform sticky for eyes and ears like ours to remain on their platform, right? So it's good for business. And I think that the primary objective of many of these business owners is more economic than political, to be honest with you. But they have very influential political voices behind the scenes that are pushing them to suppress content that is otherwise good for their business. So it's, I try to tell young people, it's not as sort of like simplistic to say that Meta, X might be different because there's like one sort of megalomaniac running that company. It's more complicated at the top because many of these guys might be indifferent to pro-Palestinian content. They might be entirely apolitical, who are like, let's get this going. Let's keep this going because it's good for business. Also, it's bad for business in the sense because I think these companies try to pride themselves on being, and it's not true, but they at least try to convey the idea that they're neutral, objective spaces for free political exchange. And when one line or viewpoint of a specific issue is being disproportionately suppressed and the other isn't, that compromises the optics for the business that they're actually fair-handed. Right? So they're struggling as well. But I think for us, I think that's where pro-Palestinian voices are definitely winning on digital media and social media, regardless of the degree of suppression. These spaces are, dominated by voices that are trying to bring as much truth to the issue as possible.
And you're even seeing like, I think it was Senator Mitt Romney from the United States of America. He was sitting with Antony Blinken and he was like pulling his hair out to the fact that he could not understand how Israel has lost the young generation to what he was saying was Hamas propaganda. But it wasn't Hamas propaganda. We had the former Prime Minister of Australia, Julia Gillard, say the exact same thing. The young generation are being manipulated by their emotions on social media. So we can definitely see that we are winning over the young generation with the Palestinian narrative to the detriment of the Israeli lobby, which in fact is far more funded than we are. They have vehicles like the Hasbara, Israeli propaganda machine, failing to keep up with what we have
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah. What would be your take on the Israeli diaspora's failure in the past
Well,
year?
I think that their failures are due to the fact that it's very difficult to criticize or debate real-time rolling reels of imagery coming out of Gaza.
Yes.
You know, when real people, and many of these people who have become vocal on Gaza didn't have a horse in the race beforehand, right?
Yes.
When they see real-time images of schools being decimated, when they read statistics that every college and university has been destroyed,
Yes.
when they see figures like 800 mosques have been destroyed in a year, right? You can't deny what's before your eyes. You know what I mean? And I think that the sheer veracity, the sheer truth of what they're seeing on their phones in real time has, I don't even like to say winning them over, because it's not even an argument. They're just seeing things for the first time in ways that we hadn't seen before. And when you see horror, catastrophe, and human tragedy of that scale, the only possible response, if you're a serious, good faith person, is to be against genocide.
Yes.
So it doesn't matter how much money the pro-Israel lobby has. They can have limitless sources of funds. They can't win this just as long as real people, you know, everyday Joes and Janes and Muhammads and Zainabs are seeing what's going on. That's why they closed the Al Jazeera office I think it was last week, right? Because they were the final mainstream media outlet that was covering the issue, right? The only way they can continue to do what they're doing is to entirely, place what's happening on the ground in the dark. And they've tried. There was internet cutoffs, censorship, shadow bans. I mean, for God's sakes, how many journalists have been killed in Gaza? 300 plus. Every notable voice, Mu'taz left, Wael Dahduh left. And it's not even a question of winning and losing. It's a question of maintenance of the status quo can only be had if they're able to sort of entirely eclipse and keep in the dark what's happening on the ground. And that's where digital media is so transformative.
Yeah, I feel like on that point, like you cannot compete with humanity.
Yeah.
Like if all you're offering the influencers and the celebrities is money to stand by your side and to support your cause and to support the Israeli agenda, you cannot compete with humanity. Like it's only a matter of time until people's hearts break. And there are some hearts which are completely hardened and they will never break. So as long as you're paying them money, they're going to support you unconditionally. But then there will be those people who will break. And I don't know, but you know, there was a picture that went viral like a couple days ago of Justin Bieber wearing a keffiyeh. I don't want to say anything on whether or not he's like brought over to the side of the truth, but you won't be surprised, because for how long can you be paid by Hasbara, by Israeli media, to support a dying cause? You know, a genocidal state, a genocidal force. You can't continue that. On saying that, given the fact that you're from America, you have Trump, Kamala Harris, next month's the election. Do any of these people have a chance of breaking in terms of their hearts and helping the Palestinian people, or are we screwed either way?
I think we're screwed either way. I think, in politics in general, specifically American politics, in order to get to that high perch of governmental prominence, your heart was already numb long ago. I'm definitely not a Trump supporter. If you read my work, I've written several pieces criticizing Trump for the Muslim ban, for his, insightful and incendiary rhetoric. But I wrote an article last week, and the article was, I cannot vote for Kamala Harris. And in some respects, I think that from an ethical perspective, voting for Kamala Harris, for me, the way I think about this as a Muslim specifically, right? And just as a human being trying to act in a good faith way, and even legally speaking, right? Trump is vile and venomous in a range of ways, arguably even more than Harris. But he is not morally culpable for a genocide.
Yes.
Right? Kamala Harris is the second most powerful person in the American government during the advancement and enabling of this genocide by the United States.
Yes.
So she is ethically and legally culpable for a genocide in ways that make her somebody you cannot vote for. And that's the position that I've taken. So we're screwed either way, to be honest with you. But, as human beings, and specifically as Muslims, there are many more things that are bigger than one presidential cycle and one election, right? And that's the kind of like vantage point I've taken on this.
So who would you advise? It could be your own opinion.
Yeah.
who would you advise the Muslims to be voting for come the next election?
Yeah. I advise, I don't
Okay.
like, I don't, you know,
Yeah,
I haven't endorsed anyone.
Yeah.
I said publicly in a post that I put up that went viral I think last week, that I would be voting for Jill Stein, but I do not endorse Jill Stein because, you know, I'm not as huge a fan of her as some others are, you know, but I feel like voting for her makes most prudent sense for me. I think what I'd like to see in the long term is that we as, not only as Muslims, but like, you know, subordinated, marginalized, oftentimes forgotten communities, the African-American community, Latino American community in this country, you know, the indigenous communities, it varies from place to place, but we need to sort of like cultivate third-party independent options that are more responsive to issues that resonate with us, without always being interlocked between the
two parties.
Exactly. Like you know, every year it seems like, or every cycle it seems like we're choosing between the lesser of two evils.
Yes. So you want to change that.
Yeah.
We've mentioned before that you are an author of several books, one of them being The New Crusades, America's War on Islam and Muslims, Islamophobia and the Global War on Islam and Muslims.
Yeah.
Given the last year and the shift in the narrative that has taken place, do you see the modern world, or at least the Western world, waking up to the lie of Islamophobia that was sold to them for the past few decades? Do you see a shift in the narrative?
I think it's a dichotomy, right? And it's a dichotomy, whereas at the grassroots level, we see it in real time again on digital media, where generally younger demographics are categorically rejecting this lie and this myth that Muslims are all terrorists.
Yes.
Remember when the genocide was commenced, remember that I'm thinking Ariel Sharon is showing my age, but Benjamin Netanyahu was adopting the very language of the war on terror, right? He was comparing Hamas to ISIS, calling Muslims and Palestinians human animals, termites, savages, barbarians, all of that, right? I think what's happening is at the grassroots level, definitely. I think that younger people across the world are looking past the lie that an entire religion, an entire faith group cannot be wed to terrorism, and see that it's, to be honest with you, racism. That's all it is, right? But I think at the top, at the governmental level, where political, economic, and media power exists, they're still very wed to Islamophobia, right? Now, changing that at the top is a far more challenging sort of proposition than changing that at the bottom. But I think it's definitely shifted.
SubhanAllah. I think one of the biggest proponents of Islamophobia, again, would have to be the media. When you look at this monstrous industry that the media has created, targeting Muslims, vilifying Muslims, from the entertainment industry to the film industry to the movies, the pop culture that we watch, that we consume, vilifying Muslims, targeting Muslims. And then when you were to look into what's taken place in the last year in Gaza alone, I can't help but think of one man who destroyed the entire narrative with 2 words. Khaled Nabhan.
Yeah.
You know, this man who looks exactly like
3 words.
The quintessential example of a terrorist.
Yeah.
Ruh al-ruh. 2 words.
Soul of my soul.
Yeah,
or is
the
that 4
soul.
words?
I guess
English.
in Arabic, but in English, it was in Arabic there were 2 words. Ruh al-ruh, the soul of my soul. This was a man who was a quintessential depiction of what a terrorist is supposed to look like according to their standards. Wearing a turban, a beard, Arab face, brown complexion.
Thob.
Comes out, thob, with the most heartfelt 2 words: loving, caring, embodying humanity in all its grace.
Yeah.
Destroyed the narrative right then and there. If you're going to write a book, I highly recommend a book on this man.
Well, actually, in the coming book I have, which is on Gaza, I write a short story based on that, and I think that, you know, his vignette is powerful, right? And you know, these are the kind of stories and vignettes. So, for instance, I wrote an article in the Harvard Law Review, and I talked about the juxtaposition between Ukrainians and Palestinians and Kashmiris specifically, and how I was really floored in the beginning of the coverage on Ukraine, because there were these powerful vignettes that you talked about, Khaled Nabhan, of, you know, grandmothers in Ukraine making meals for the soldiers. I'm a huge boxing fan, former boxers, the Klitschko brothers, for instance, taking arms, right? Other, notable figures who are being celebrated in very careful, beautiful, sublime ways, like these beautiful stories that were on CNN, the BBC, Fox News. We never had that. Like, again, like I've said this many times, like if you were to ask a normal average Joe on the street, can you name one Palestinian? They'd struggle to do so. But because of social media, we see people like Khaled Nabhan. We see how much he loved his young granddaughter Reem. We come to know the faces and the contours of the faces, the stories of people like Hind Rajab, right? Of people like Mu'taz. Like we grow to love these people even though we've never met them. So for the first time in human history, the stories of real life people who have been victimized and tragically dehumanized in Gaza are finally coming to the fore, and they're shaking people, right? They're awakening people,
yes,
and they're forcing them to reevaluate how they think about this issue.
Yes, even like we can't run away from someone like Wa'il al-Dahduh, who came out like this humble giant, this heartfelt giant who lost his wife, lost his children, lost his grandchildren,
and kept on coming to work. Yeah, exactly. And there's beauty to that. Even apart from individual stories, like one thing that young people always tell me all the time, even non-Muslims, are, hey man, like it's crazy to me, like this is their words, like I'm trying to say how they say it. It's crazy to me that these people have lost their loved ones and lost their families. Their mosques have been destroyed, but every Friday we see them going to pray for Jum'ah, right? So like these kinds of like images and stories are so powerful, right? They're not only reawakening people, but in some respects, they're eroding Islamophobia in ways that we can't yet appreciate because, and you saw it a little bit after 9/11, like people now are wanting to study Islam and being like, let me learn for myself what this religion actually stands for, apart from, how legacy and mainstream media are assailing it.
Let me learn Islam for what it stands for, given that we finally realize that everything that America is telling us has been an utter lie.
Exactly.
For the past 20 years about Muslims and Islam.
Yep.
So that would have to be a very powerful way to, I guess, conclude our podcast. If you do have any final thoughts you'd like to mention on the topic of Islamophobia, Islam and Muslims, especially in light of what's taking place in Gaza, please feel free to share them with our audience and our viewers.
If I can make a plug.
Yeah,
so my book, Eyes on Gaza, Witnessing Annihilation, I think it's available for pre-order now on all platforms. That's the one thing. The second thing, especially for young people who may feel exhausted, who may feel like this is going on for too long, it's important to keep your voices up. Keep talking about what's happening, not only in Gaza, but also Lebanon, Yemen, and other places. But also, what's happening to Uyghur Muslims, what's happening in Sudan and Congo. We oftentimes neglect other issues where genocides are taking place. And even though it might seem heavy for us to talk about all these things, to keep our eyes on all these issues. So.
May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be with all the brothers and sisters around the world that are suffering, that are falling victim to oppression wherever they may be. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alleviate the suffering of our brothers and sisters in Gaza. Professor Khaled Beydoun, it's been a pleasure having you on the podcast. Thank you very much. And until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum.